Hello friends, thank you for joining me today on Archaeologists in Quarantine. Today we're going to be discussing Approaching Colonialism and Archaeology. I am joined by Gabby, a Guianese archaeologist from the French Guiana. We have Maria, a Danish archaeologist who focuses her studies on the Near Eastern archaeology. And then we have Carlton Shield, Carlton Shield, Chef. I can't believe I'm so sorry, Carlton.
Oh, it's no worries.
I was doing so well, guys. And then I just stumbled. Carlton Shield Chief Gover, who's an Indigenous archaeologist. And I feel as I muddled Carlton's introduction, I feel, Carlton, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Carlton Shield Chief Gover. I'm a PhD student in anthropology here at the University of Colorado Boulder in the United States. My subfield is archaeology, and I study Central Plains prehistoric archaeology and the oral traditions of indigenous nations that used to live there to help interpret the archaeological record.
Wow. Okay, Gabby, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Carlton, that was such a short presentation. And so, wow, I'm hoping to do. Okay, so I'm Gabby. I'm from Guyana, which is still a French colony in South America, specifically in the Amazon region, but also near the Caribbean. So we have a lot of cultural heritage that is close to Caribbean cultural area, I would say. So why do I define myself first? Because of my land. It has to do with what we're going to talk about. And until now, I think I'm the only Guianese archaeologist. So that's something we will mention as well. I'm a PhD student in Brazil, specifically in the Federal University of Minas Gerais in southeastern Brazil. And I try to rethink archaeology theoretically and in its practice, specifically based on non-Western world perceptions, specifically Afro-diasporic. That's it for now.
Thank you. And Maria, please introduce yourself.
Yeah. So I'm Maria, and I study Near Eastern archaeology at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm currently writing my master thesis on childhood and children in the pre-pottery Neolithic and the burial customs, and trying to explore how it was to be a child during this period. Kind of.
And, oh, sorry. And me, my name is Natasha. I am based in the UK. I would define myself as a British field commercial archaeologist. Basically, my day-to-day work is recovering archaeological deposits before they are generally destroyed. So it's very the hands-on side of the archaeological world. So as I said, today we will be discussing approaching colonialism and archaeology. I would say personally, it's a subject that I did not think of until really in the last few years, where I started discussing this subject with others and they continuously brought this theme. And it's important for us to actually discuss it openly. So as I would like to say, like a little disclaimer, these are our opinions, our perspectives. We're using really everything from what we study, our work, our own ethics to maybe answer the questions that you, the public, may ask us and what we will be discussing today. So it's our opinions. Okay, so when I think of colonialism, it goes back as far as the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Moors, the Ottomans. But generally, I say in today's society, we're thinking from the 16th century onwards. When we now think of colonialism, that's what we're thinking. So I think the first question that I'd like to start off with is, how can we dismantle the structure of colonialism in archaeology and heritage management? It's a really big subject, and I can see Carlton looking up there, and I feel maybe you might be able to.
That's a hard question right off the bat. Like, we're going in the deep end, like right at the beginning of this.
Why not?
I'm still trying to articulate an answer. Come back to me here in a moment.
Okay. Think. Okay, Gabby, any ideas?
So yeah, your question was really broad, but as we already mentioned, colonialism is a huge subject. I think one of the first steps is to acknowledge how colonialistic the archaeologist is right now, not just its historical ties to colonialism and specifically European colonialism in terms of archaeology as a discipline, as a science, as a knowledge field, you would say, right? And this is already not done, right? I mean, not all archaeologists are aware and even acknowledge in a political sense how much what they're doing is linked with colonial violence that is still going on today, you know? So that would be my first element of answer.
Thank you. Maria?
Yes, I will agree with Gabby. And like, first we need to realize the history, but also like the current colonialism that still goes on. And then I think like a way to kind of do this and is also to remember to include Indigenous people in their own culture, like talk about them, include them. Like it's so often that we don't see like Indigenous archaeologists who are actually from the exact culture that is being excavated. Like we need more people who know the culture, who has the heritage already, instead of like me going to the Middle East and just dig up stuff. Like I have no heritage, culture, or like connection to the Middle East. Like we should work with the people whose culture and heritage it actually is. So I think like we need to be more open in that sense too.
Yes, it's quite interesting what you both just raised there. Carlton, do you have anything to add?
Absolutely. I think, as Maria said, collaboration with Indigenous groups upon, who are descendant communities of the culture that you're studying is absolutely important. Especially when you're talking about interpretation, just having their knowledge, is critical to understanding maybe what would be going on. And going off with what Gabby said in terms of respecting Indigenous people and their way of life, even though it's different from Euro-American perspectives and worldviews, it's important because we have these Indigenous groups that are still existing and they've survived through genocides, both forced and kind of proximity ones. And having them, and it really just comes down to respect, right? These are completely different worldviews that have been kind of at odds for hundreds of years now. And you just have to treat them like you would anybody else and respect their views because they're living people. And even though they might have different views towards place or religion, that doesn't make them any less than the overarching colonizing government.
Exactly.
I thought I would just start with a big topic first because we're all kind of off guard. So sometimes our best answers are given when we're not expecting it. So that's why, so apologies in advance. Well, not in advance. I won't be doing any more questions like that. So from going on forwards, as we've all said, we've all kind of got the same themes here. We should be speaking to the locals or people who least respect the archaeology in that area and their history. And it's something so important that a lot of places do not even consider. If we look at museum displays, for example, which we will come back to a bit later, there's so much going on now. And I think I would say from my point of view, I've noticed more people are questioning this. So going on from that, archaeology and its history are directly related to colonialism. What are the impacts of this history on today's practice? Maria, if we could start with you, I think, because I know this is something you've actually mentioned a few times, and it would be great if you could spare this conversation.
Yes. So as a very, what would you say, very European person of descent, like my culture and heritage is very European based. I feel it's really, really important to be aware when I go like to the Middle East, be aware of the history of how European white people have treated the country and the people and the history that goes on there, because I feel very privileged in many ways when I go on a site, sometimes in the Middle East, because the most recent was in Israel, where you have these huge sites, and then you have like 200 to 300 people working as workers, and they're all Arab. Every single one of them is paid like a really low wage. It's higher than other places, but like they're Arabs, and they they're not rich people, and they work a minimum wage and do all the hard labor. And so for me to be there was really important to like not feel like I was superior just because I have a degree or something like that, and just I don't know, just work with them instead of trying to be more than them. And just like remember that this site we were digging up is like 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, and it's part of their heritage and not necessarily mine. I just have a great interest in what we were doing. So like, and at university we are taught, because I live in Denmark, so we have this issue of colonialism, and we're taught about it in classes. Like we've had like classes on Orientalism, and Edward Said's book Orientalism, and the us and them, all of that structure. We've had classes on it because we need to be aware of how Europeans have kind of conquered these countries in archaeology and stuff early on. So I just always keep that in mind. In some
Yes,
ways.
it's interesting what you just said, Orientalism. It's a term actually I came across today whilst I was doing a quick research before this live stream.
Yeah.
So Orientalism is the concepts, assumptions, and discursive practices that were used to produce, interpret, and evaluate knowledge of non-European people. Just in case anybody doesn't know. So it's actually really interesting that there's even this theory. So I think it's positive. It's positive that we're being taught to approach it from that point of view. I think this is positive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I think if I can just continue with what Maria says, it all comes down to a few questions that seem simple, but are eventually really disturbing for many, many archaeologists and scientists in general, who are mostly based in the West and in the Northern Hemisphere. The questions are, who is doing archaeology and science in general? For whom? And why, for which purpose? And so many practitioners of archaeology and a diversity of kinds of archaeology that exist do not necessarily want to even think about these questions and about the answers. Because when we approach the questions and the answers, it comes to disturbing facts and inequalities of today. And a lot of archaeologists really prefer to think of their jobs or their science or whatever as some sort of supreme thing for the welfare of humanity, when we know that the world is not a balanced or equal place. We know that there are structures of inequality. And so, I mean, just in terms of the number of Black Afro-diasporic archaeologists in the world, it's extremely low. Same thing for Indigenous archaeologists. And not that we would necessarily need to have equal amount of archaeologists of all kind of people and places, but it just reflects how unbalanced the whole science is. And so if only like a huge majority of white and people from the North are doing archaeology, what does it say about the kind of archaeology that is being done? And why is it okay for people from other places to be doing science, to be looking and digging specifically things and people, from other places and from other times, and not necessarily, not even including, I would say, just ask the same people whose history it is to collaborate, and not even collaborate, to think the research through, So I think these are questions that are really essential in the sense of we know now that archaeology exists for a purpose. It is political. It is not a neutral thing. It has been used, and it's still being used for nationalist purposes. It has been used for fascist purposes and colonialistic purposes, obviously. So where do we fit into this today's equation right now, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's really nice points.
Very, I think, important points here again that you've just highlighted there. Wow, it's just something you said, it's so true. You know, you spoke about should the ethnicity of an individual, and if we were to look at the ratio of ethnics, Indigenous archaeologists in ratio to maybe more European Caucasians, this ratio, for example, in the UK, it's been brought to my attention because I am, you know, I'm an ethnic minority, continuously brought to my attention that I am one of a few. So is this important? Personally, for my job, what I do, my role, I don't actually think it's important what ethnic background I am, because it doesn't actually affect my actual job. Because I do field archaeology in the UK, I'm interpreting British archaeology. So for me, it's my angle anyway is maybe my education, who my mentors are, right? Is how I interpret the archaeology I find. And it's all British related. So for me personally, in what I do not think my ethnicity nor my gender should actually affect my job and my interpretation of something. And the reason why I said ethnicity and gender is because both these have been brought in as a comparative. People like to compare. Does somebody complete background, something that may define an individual, does that affect their approach to archaeology? So I just want to say that. That's my personal opinion. Of course, in what Gabby, Carlton, and Maria do, I think what you guys do is actually quite different. And if anything, your backgrounds help and support how you conduct archaeology from my point of view. So
Can I say something to that, what you just mentioned? Because I think one way that it actually kind of matters with your ethnicity is that people will feel more represented if they see more people with a minority background in this exact field. It's like when we have the discussions of should there be homosexuals on TV? Of course there should be, because small kids who identify with this, if they don't ever see it, they will never like feel comfortable with it. They will have a difficult time with it. So I think it's really important that you're in England, you're a minority, ethnic minority, sorry. And like, if people see you, if children see you, they might feel like, oh, I can become this too. So I feel like, and I feel like that's also, as like a person who identifies as a woman, that's often also the case, that like you kind of, it might feel like a bit of a like thing that you have to be like a role model or something, but like you represent something to others, and they might be able to better identify and find their way by seeing that someone who is like them actually is in this field. So in that way, I think it's like that it actually has a kind of purpose and meaning and importance.
Yeah, I think you're right there, actually. And it's something I rarely think about, but now that you've just mentioned that, it's true. I have done talks at schools. I've been asked, can you please come to this school? They've seen me at work or in a project, and I've been asked to come in because I'm outside of the box, completely in the archaeological sphere. So yeah, you're right, Maria. And thank you again for reminding me, actually. It's a very true positive aspect of me as a person and what I do when I do outreach. So yeah, you're right. Any other additions to that? I know it's you.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many things to say about that. That's why I'm trying to keep it, you know, even a little shorter. But it is a fascinating conversation, and I feel like I thank you actually to create this space for us to have this conversation, because it's so necessary. And I feel the lack of it in other spaces that are supposedly made for archaeologists to talk about not just research, but the way that they conduct research. And I think it even goes beyond being represented, you know. I have a personal example to add to this conversation. Um, um, I don't believe that science in itself and archaeology is part of science is neutral. I don't believe that different individuals make the same kind of science. They might believe they do, and science has been put as this supreme um, personless entity that is neutral, that is for a higher aim, but we know it's not the case. So I know for sure that when I do archaeology in my home country and I do the whole research in our native language that is typically excluded from knowledge making, for example, I do a different kind of archaeology than the rest of my colleagues that are all European, French speaking, or North American archaeologists. And I don't have the same research questions. My background doesn't make me approach what I do in the same way. I might even refuse to do certain things that other archaeologists with different backgrounds would not feel is problematic because of my background, because of my ethnicity, if you would name it like that, if because of my spirituality even. So this is what it has to do with going. The representativity is extremely interesting and important, I would say. Like I was saying in my presentation earlier, I'm until now the only Guianese archaeologist, and I'm still in the process of studying. So the archaeology that is being done right now, except from my research projects, is by Westerners, specifically French people. And it has a really direct impact. People in Guyana do not see an interest to archaeology, and most of them do not know what it is because there is no outreach efforts. When the outreach effort is being done, it's not in their language or the language that everyone uses, because the official language is colonial language, which is French, you know. So every little thing, every little aspects of it matter. And part of my research is just to ask myself, what would a Guianese, then specifically an Afro-Guianese archaeology would look like? And some things are different from what I learned that is archaeology. For example, an important element is how our culture that is really African based and indigenous based is around orality. So I cannot start thinking about an archaeology project without the talking element and going back to the elders to talk. This is part of my methodology, you know. So in this sense, we're creating other kinds of archaeology that exist alongside others, and I think it's fine. You know, we don't need to have the same process applied to every context, you know.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off of Gabby, you know, extremely similar situations in North America and the United States in particular. You know, archaeology is inherently seen as a colonial endeavor by indigenous people. And it goes back to a long history of, you know, the reservation systems. You know, Native Americans in the United States weren't allowed to practice their own religion until 1978. And then their graves were not protected until 1990. So we're talking about a really recent history in which indigenous people in this country have been given the same rights that their Euro-American citizens and counterparts have been given since the 1700s, and then other ethnic groups later. And as part of that, you know, the treatment to indigenous people here in the United States, archaeology is extremely contentious because it's, before these things were protected, archaeologists in the 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s would just go out and loot, or basically loot sites in terms of like grave goods, skeletons. And this also happened in Europe, where European archaeologists would come to indigenous cultures and places here and just take what they wanted and send it back to Europe. You know, the the Royal Museum in Sweden is in particular to that. And because of that history, indigenous populations here in the United States are extremely wary of archaeology and other indigenous people who practice it. And when I first got in this field and as a citizen of the Pawnee Nation, I felt a lot of pushback from some of my indigenous family because they were very curious as to why I got in the field. It's seen as grave robbing and looting primarily. But it wasn't until I proved that I was doing archaeology from an indigenous perspective, using the oral traditions and using indigenous knowledge as the foundation for my research. We're like, okay, yeah, no, this is how you're supposed to do it. But in terms of like other indigenous archaeologists, there's maybe 100. Like there's a small group of us at the National Museum. We all know each other. On the plains, it's me and 3 other individuals. And that's 3 people in terms of the largest geographic region in North America work on indigenous cultures. Like it's few and far between. And in terms of like me I'm primarily European, as you guys can probably tell. The fact that I'm one of the more one of the indigenous archaeologists that's mostly promoted is kind of a testament to the fact of how slim the field is, right? And then also it comes back to which indigenous tribes even allow it. Like the Seminole in Florida, they have cultural taboos about dealing with the dead, so you technically can't even be an archaeologist, and they actually hire out British archaeologists to work in their department because they don't trust American archaeologists. And same with the Navajo or the Dene, as they like to be called, as they call themselves here in the Southwest. Like it's layered because, you know, archaeology is inherently a Western science. And then just trying to be an indigenous person in that field, you have to then balance between your indigenous identity, your indigenous values with how do you practice in the field of archaeology. And it's a balancing act. And, you know, some people are better at it than others.
Thank you for that. It's one of those things where we imagine how other people deal with certain situations of dealing with their heritage or sensitive subjects, right? Me personally, I remember I was excavating in Siberia. I was working in a place called the Republic of Tuva, this region. Actually, that's what this tattoo is from. And it was so interesting because when we started to deal with human remains, we actually had local archaeologists to come in and deal with it. They were there. As soon as it came to anything to do with human remains, we had locals who had an association with that culture. And that was the first time I had been in a situation where I was able to see that, you know, something as Carlton and Gabby have both said is quite rare, that you're able to deal with your own heritage in the way that you feel is fit for your community. It's so rare, and being able to experience that firsthand, it started to make me realize the importance of it. Bearing in mind, again, what I personally do, it's not something I've ever had to think about before, even all of my education, because I've always focused on British archaeology. And even today, and I realized this literally maybe 20 minutes before I was about to go live, I hardly looked at Asian effects, the effects of colonialism on Asia. I know of it, but I didn't research in depth the impact of colonialism and imperialism on this region. And this just goes to show how I've been conditioned to think in a certain way through my education, through my social surroundings. And it's just so many things now that I have to start to question, I think, about myself. So thanks.
No. Sorry, I disagree. I think asking questions about ourselves is precisely why we need to have this conversation, because one of the effects of colonialism is that we know I would say the big stories about the West, about Northern Hemisphere, about Europe, mainly in North America. And we don't know our own stories. I identify as a colonized person from colonized people, for example, and from a colonized land. And I mentioned this to you on some other time. Like as a Guianese person, my whole school education when I was in Guyana, like at a young age, was about learning things about France. you know, the geography and the history, and we all know about the European Union and when Greece entered European Union, for example, but we don't know about South America, we don't know about Guyana, we don't know about Guyana's geography, you know? And I think it is maybe some of the things that might attract some of us colonized and people who have been put into minority and ethnic groups, minority ethnic groups, is that archaeology goes beyond the written record. It goes beyond what is being put as history by European and Western people. So I saw archaeology as a way for me to learn about myself, about my ancestors. And as a person of African descent, and specifically, my ancestors have been put into slavery by European colonialism and enslavement. It's the same process. And I don't know as much about their stories and about their names as I could have in another time and place, you know. So archaeology has been a way for me to go and find some fragments of their lives, you know, some fragments about my own story. But when I get into archaeology and actually what is being taught reproduces the colonialistic big story, I would say it's still of no help, you know. So in this sense, that's why it's frustrating, because I'm like, oh, finally, you know, I can actually learn about myself, and then I get there and it's still the same European and Western centered stories that are being studied and by the same people. So the question, I think, is, do we want to reproduce what is colonialism in Western science and Westernized science, which puts specifically in anthropology and archaeology, the other, you know, at the center, in the sense of my history and my ancestors and their things and their places and their stories, or the other of who does archaeology, you know? And so I am, when I get into archaeology, I'm an other doing archaeology, you know? I don't even have a place in this sense. So that's why when Carlton says that about putting indigenous ways of perceiving the world at the center of what he does, you know, in archaeology, I totally, you know, agree, and I try and do the same thing. That's why I read a lot about indigenous archaeology. It's so inspiring because a lot of indigenous archaeologists have written and done things that are really different than mainstream archaeology, and proven that it's actually a way that is not perfect, but less violent, because a lot of us colonized people feel, and I do, I'm an archaeology, and I feel like archaeology is a violent science, you know. I feel like when we are not even in the conversation about whether or not we want some archaeological project to be done, you know, it's violent. It reproduces the same power structures that have taken a lot from us, that have dispossessed us from stories and names of my ancestors, for example. So it is a really a conversation about the othering, I would say. I don't want this othering to be something that is given, you know, in archaeology. I want it to be, it's not to say that people who are not from a community cannot do research, but at least they should ask, you know, they should ask. And it's not like they should be denied permission, but if that happens, that's something that happens, you know. We should have this conversation about things we're willing to give up, you know.
Thank you for that. Before we move on, Carlton, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of talking about like how critical indigenous knowledge is and ways of knowing. I think it's what Gilgamesh is the recognized story that has persisted through time the longest. Am I correct? It's like 6,000 years. I mean,
Yeah.
part of my story is looking at Pawnee, Arikara, and Wichita oral traditions. You know, they provide relative chronologies, and then I use archaeology to provide the absolute ones, and I can date some of these oral traditions back over 1,000 years. But a lot of indigenous groups in the United States have oral traditions about coming over here from Beringia. I mean, that's over 10 to 15,000 years old of persistence in through being passed on through oral traditions. So when people, it's really bad here in the United States still, and especially some places in Canada, where oral traditions are seen as less valid or less authentic because they're not written, even though we have plenty of cases with historic records being completely inaccurate or imprecise. But I think, in the United States, we've really, since the 1990s, have started going through like a paradigm shift towards valuing indigenous narratives, indigenous peoples. So now when archaeologists go to a reservation, they have to ask for permission to work. And we see much more promotion and support of indigenous peoples, but there's still a long way to go. A buddy of mine, and I'll never forget this, he told me archaeology moves forward one death at a time. You're waiting for old people to pass on so that way they can stop interfering with younger generations trying to progress the science. It's cryptic, but I've found it in my career to be extremely accurate.
I mean, just your last statement there, yes, I would have to agree. And yeah, I can see why it resonates so much. It's like when somebody asks you, would you work in a museum? Can you get a job? And the first thing you're thinking of, well, actually, we have so many people who have set the stones and unfortunately don't want to budge sometimes a theory. And we do have to sometimes wait. And that's literally what you've got to push. You've got to push from your angle. As I can imagine, Gabby, you're trying to do, you're constantly pushing your theories, and it's hard because you're against a wall. You're against a wall that's been built up, for a very long time. Which brings us on to the next question. Are there ways to address the consequences of the past and ongoing colonialism in the way we practice archaeology? Is there a way we can move forward, basically? Gabby.
Yeah, I think we have approached a little bit some steps that can be taken, right? Well, Maria has been mentioning the fact that she acknowledges how doing research in a certain place, her privileges, and I think we all have to do that first step about positioning ourselves in the research and positioning the research. I think these are essential steps. And then also really shifting and decentering archaeologists from the conversation and from archaeology itself. It seems radical for some people, but I really believe that if we do what we're doing it for a reason and for people. And once we determine who we're working for, a lot of this conversation has been brought up by archaeologists of African descent. A lot of them are African American, actually, about finding who is our ethical client. We might have different kind of audiences and people we work for or whatever, but eventually whose stories are we telling, And so once we identify that, we should also stay silent in some sense and listen. I feel like this is essential in a sense of once we decenter ourselves from the research in the first place, then we can do better research. Then we can do research that is less violent, that will not necessarily reproduce things. And it's not only about inviting one native or indigenous or local person to the table where you already decided everything. It's literally at the beginning of research, if there should be a research in the first place, during the whole process, is working with people. It's literally the whole process has to be collaborative, and a lot of discussions that are being made in around collaborative archaeology is, but should every archaeological research project should be collaborative? And some people say, some of them we can't, there's no way we can do that. I disagree. I think we can always find ways to, be less self-sufficient as archaeologists, especially since a lot of archaeologists are white Western archaeologists, So this goes through education in archaeology, first of all, and education about colonialism, about different inequalities, learning about how science is political, learning the implications of our work in really concrete things that are happening right now. So it's I mentioned a few things, and I'm guessing Carlton and Maria will add some more things, and because there's so much to do, you know. But essentially, it comes to shifting the way that we approach what is archaeology, you know.
Yeah, I agree with you, Gabby, and I feel like an important way to also do this is like teaching about colonialism, what it is, what it has done to the archaeology, the history of it, teach it at university, but also like countries and nations such as like the UK, the US, like teach it like in high school. Don't just teach it when you get further along in your education, like teach the teach about like, okay, so this country colonized this country, and what did that actually do to the people who lived in that country, instead of just being like, oh, we're England and we can just take over all countries in the world and then not talk about it. Kind of like the imperialism kind of just goes away, like you just mentioned that you did it, and then not like educate on like what it meant for the people who actually lived in these countries and actually lived there before. So like start earlier, talk about all of this destructive stuff we have done from Europe's side to large part of the world. Like talk about it earlier on so people actually know about it. So it's not just us as academics who sit and have a conversation about it, and like everybody should have this idea of what colonialism is, what it has created, because you see it's like, as we're talking about politics, like the whole, in Denmark we have some extreme political parties who, one of them almost was voted into parliament last year, or last year, and they seriously want to throw every Muslim person out of our country. They're like, just throw them out. They're not supposed to be here. We hate them, and that's like colonialism in some sort of way. Like the whole otherness, like they're different than us. It goes back to the whole like creating a picture of us versus them. It's also based on colonialism. So I think like we should teach these things to young adults and like teenagers, and not just people who attend university, because then you exclude so many people from having this conversation and actually gain the knowledge of what. Yeah, sorry, I've been talking for a long time.
No, that was great, Maria, and I totally agree with you. I think, I mean, here in the U.S., you know, archaeology is part of anthropology. It's not part of history, but having that taught in high schools would be absolutely critical, because, you know, the whole part of anthropology is the holistic study of human culture through space and time. Basically, like, you learn a lot in how to not be ethnocentric. How do you interact with other cultures, and how do you appreciate them for what they are and not through the lens that you've grown up in?
Mm.
Um, and absolutely agree with kind of talking about some of these historical cases. You know, the United States has a problem with even acknowledge, you in American history classes in school, we start with, 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and that's when history starts. And it completely negates over 10,000 years of indigenous occupation in North and South America, but it starts with European contact. If you're lucky, you'll learn about the Vikings getting here to Canada before anyone else. But so I think education, both in the greater overarching culture and the political and the public system, but also with indigenous groups, education through kind of what archaeology is, anthropology is, or how to be indigenous and have be part of a minority culture. And like kind of a big thing that I've been doing is I've teamed up with a couple Indigenous comic illustrators, and we're doing a project that we're trying to get grant funded to make archaeology comics specifically for Indigenous children to show, hey, this is something that has a lot of money for Indigenous kids to get funded through school, but also like look at the value of it, how you can help, how can you be an active member of your community and protect your culture while also using a form of science that can help project your Indigenous sovereignty. Because that's like a big part of, you know, what archaeology can do. If you know more about your past, you can use it to help the present and kind of predict the future. So like a big part of what I've done is I work on a site in northeastern Nebraska. It's the largest site for its time period. You know, the site is over a mile long. Thousands of people live there. And we had a committee from the Pawnee Nation. I had them come up and we were showing them the site because like they didn't know anything about this time in our nation's history. And I'll never forget, like one of the committee members asked, like, so how many Pawnees used to live here? And it was actually my colleague Devin Pettigrew looked at her and said, thousands of Pawnees used to live here. She's like, thousands? Like, yeah, thousands. And you know, our tribe used to be at max 60,000 in 1850, and by 1890 we were down to 300. So the concept of thousands of people in one place, when there's only 3,500 of us today, and only the largest population of Pawnees is 600 in one spot. So like just even using archaeology and some of these sciences to show like how prominent our past used to be and kind of how we've overcome difficulties in the past, whether that be through climate or other populations moving in. You know, it's a two-way street, education both for the general public, but also education in a different sense for Indigenous communities. That was a rant, and I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah, I'll just add something else that came to mind when I was listening to you guys. I think education is key. Yeah, we talked about education, other people, and in educating our own peoples. But I feel like one way that we can shift this is also by educating ourselves as people who frequent academia or other archaeological, you know, spaces like congresses, and also by ourselves, you know, like which authors are we using to produce articles, for example. And to shift that in the sense of, instead of using the same classic authors, you know, that everyone uses and has as references, start reading archaeologists from groups that have been put as minority. For example, I'm a member of the Society of Black Archaeologists, which is a nonprofit right now, but was and still is a network of Black archaeologists, mostly in North America, but worldwide. And one thing about having these groups and these associations is that we know that there are people producing things, there are people producing different kinds of archaeology, and we don't read them and we don't cite and quote these people, Indigenous archaeologists, and not necessarily from the Northern Hemisphere. A lot of amazing decolonial archaeology is being done in the South by people who are Black, who are Indigenous, and even white Brazilian or South American archaeologists, but who really have this commitment of trying to shift this unbalanced relationship with traditional communities, but in general with the narratives that we tell. So I feel like we have to get some strength from what is being done, because even if it's not a lot, it will contribute to changing what we write and what we say in the stories we tell, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, did you have something to say, Maria, or? No? Okay. It's so interesting, you know, all the points that we're raising. Colonialism, it's a very large, it's a broad topic, and it's affected literally today, 2020. It's affected the whole shift in society, the economics, social, the law, human rights. Everything has come from this stage of colonialism. if we now were to look at museums and repatriation schemes, this is a very big, yes, Gabby, your reaction is so true, because it's such a topic that, and I personally don't know where I stand on it, but I'm just going to give some figures, okay? Some figures that I was astounded to read. The British Museum, which I love, I love going there. It's helped me to continuously keep the drive and willingness to enjoy archaeology, right? And the artifacts. I love it there. But there's also a darker side to it. How did those artifacts get there? It's a question not many of us ask. We just see something like the Rosetta Stone, we gaze at it, we're like, wow, that's amazing. And then we go and look at something else that has been put there at some point in time. Now, a few fun facts. The British Museum was founded in 1753 and opened to the public in 1759. These dates are key because the majority, for example, of the Egyptian artifacts was around 50,000 artifacts, excuse me, around 50,000 artifacts. Now, how did they end up at the British Museum? Well, during the Egyptian rule, so whilst some of you may not know, Egypt was under the British colony from 1882 to 1956. During this time, a lot of artifacts were brought back to the UK, and a lot of foreign expeditions were done in Egypt, mainly by the French, German, American, as well as the British. Now, over a third of artifacts registered at the British Museum was done between 1900 to 1910. Over 7,000 objects were registered. Yes, they were catalogued and deemed as artifacts for display. Now, the keyword here is display. How many artifacts are actually displayed at the British Museum? Around 80,000. They have just over 8 million objects in archive. Yeah, and about 1% is shown to the public. Then you have private collections. You have something like the Victoria and Albert Museum. Again, it's amazing to go and visit and see. At one point, that was a private collection. There's something like 240,000 objects of the world there. Amazing to look at. But again, how did they get to the UK, to this display? So, opening the floor, what do we think about repatriation?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of European museums start as private collections. I think that goes into like a kind of a question or discussion about class and the upper class having access to all these things and the lower class. Repatriation is, a really touchy subject, especially in the United States. The Native American, what we have here, the Native American Graves Protections and Repatriation Act of 1990, 30 years ago, that's when Native Americans had rights to burials and skeletons and ancestors that were dug up. And there's still a lot in museums. There's still a lot in archaeological collections here because older people who were pre-NAGPRA hate that law. And they literally have skeletons in their closet that they've been hiding. And so once again, waiting for them to die so we can get these things back. Most museums in the United States have moved away from, have totally gone with this repatriation model and been giving things back. It's now we're at the question in most museums of who does it belong to. All the stuff that we know which tribal nation it belonged to has gone back. Now it's trying to figure out the nitty gritty, some of the more gray area objects. But we still have a lot of problems in the United States with European museums because they don't abide by United States laws. Trying to get those things back. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a bunch of Navajo pottery that was on sale in France at an auction house. And everyone's like, can we have that back? Like, nah. So I think it goes into, at that point, international law. And it depends on when, because we didn't have antiquities laws in the United States until the 19th century. So if things were taken before then, before the United States had the laws, legally, a lot of these European nations have legal authority, but more, like ethically and morally, not so much. Yeah, I mean, things should go back to, their home indigenous culture. I mean, that's what I believe. Especially, some of these other places like Greece and Egypt, You know, they have the facilities, if you want to look at these terms of like, they can take care of their own objects, right? And some of these examples of like, well, you know, look what happened to Germany in the 1940s. Like, we bombed their museums, so like their artifacts weren't safe there. And it's like, yeah, but you know, that wasn't, you know, Nicaragua bombing Germany. That was, you know, Allied powers. Like, this isn't, you can't use historical accounts of war as a means to keep objects and artifacts away from their home culture. It's just not, I don't know. I think it's heavily political.
I feel just the last point you made, it is now a war crime, right, to actually attack cultural heritage sites. That was one of the big things when Trump went out and said that he was going to bomb some historical sites in there in January, because that's actually a war crime now. You can't do that. That's a really big no-go. Like, you can still do it, but it's a war crime. And I agree that these things should go back to like where they came from. The things we have in museums and such, like, if I feel like right now Europe is in like, we have so many artifacts and stuff like that in our position, and we should like give them back. But I feel like if we in Denmark have something from an area right now where there's a big civil war going on, and we have ISIS who target like big cultural sites, we should maybe wait until like that stuff is over before returning it, because then it can't be kept safe. But like, as you mentioned, Greece, like there's the marbles in Britain. The, how do you pronounce it? Is it the how is it, like, yeah, the
to do with the Pantheon marbles, I think it's kind of nicknamed, but there's obviously a technical term.
Exactly, yeah, it's the
Elgin, yeah, Elgin was the British guy that took them, but I think people have started calling them the Parthenon marbles now to kind of recognize, yeah.
But they have been asking for them back. I think it is like for a century or something like that, and they've just been keep on asking. And like, then there's been the arguments about, oh, revolutions and wars in Greece, but it's like, yeah, but Greece is peaceful now, and the European Union is stepping in since 2013 to get those marbles back. And like, it is now becoming like, Greece want to have it signed into the Brexit, that they need to get the marbles back. And it's like, just give the fucking marbles back. It's like, it's their cultural heritage. And also, like, you can just make a 3D copy of it. We have so many advantages today. We can just make a copy. Like, a normal person going to a museum, a person who, like, people won't notice if it's a copy or not unless they read it's a copy. Like, it's so stupid. Like, just make a copy, send it back to where it came from, where it belongs. So I remember, was it Boris Johnson before when he was mayor or something like that? I think it was when ISIS targeted a cultural heritage site in Syria, and he went out and said that this is really sad because this is the our, like, as in Britain's cultural heritage too. So it's like, when is it one country's cultural heritage, or when is it like the world's heritage, and who does it then belong to? Because he was kind of like, oh, this is everybody's heritage, but it's like, yeah, but it's kind of more Syrian people's. Like, I know that you like it, but like, that doesn't mean it's your heritage. Like, yeah, it's a heritage in the sense that it was from a historical period that has affected like periods afterwards and affected the way we live today, because it was like urban civilization and stuff, but that doesn't make it his heritage. Like, still people in Syria. So it's so weird.
I will not necessarily go into much details about why I think that things should be repatriated, because I think we all share the same opinion. But I want to ask you guys to this question, like, for us to discuss a little bit. What do you think is at stake for these Western museums to refuse to do this, which for our generation maybe, and for, you know, ourselves, I'm not going to talk about all of people from our generation, but we see this as something normal, and why don't they do it? But what is at stake for these institutions to just refuse, even today, and probably for a lot of years to come?
Our museums would be empty. That's why. No, but like, I think it's still colonialism and the power, like having the power to keep things, and that we feel like now we've had it for 100 years, now it's ours. Like if you kind of lend your shirt to a friend and then you stop seeing that friend, and then like the shirt is kind of theirs now. I feel like that's how the museums see it. Like, oh, we've had it for so long, now it's ours. Like, it's become part of our culture to have these monuments and artifacts. I don't know, I feel like it's a power thing, and like feeling ownership of a culture because you've had it in your possession for 100 years or something.
It's interesting because then you have to start to think about, what is the purpose of a museum? If we were to repatriate everything, what would happen? So I think, if anything, maybe there should be more of an agreement between institutions. It's like the whole idea of loaning something. Now, this is actually an interesting word, loan, because there have been some cases with, for instance, the British Museum, where, of course, they've been asked to give back some artifacts. Instead of giving them back, they said that we will loan it to you for 90 years. So this is their answer, right? But it's a really hard one, because then what do we do with museums? If there's something that's not so, say a national museum, so the Egyptian Museum gives permission for them to have these artifacts, I think that's great. As long as we can somehow keep the possibility to see these cultures. However, I am aware of how much we have of other cultures hidden in boxes, stored away, that probably will never be looked at for another 50 years, if you're lucky, unless an exhibition comes along or somebody does some research. It's like both sides, and it's a really hard one, I think. It's a hard question to answer.
Well, I think, like you said, in museums across the globe, less than 1% of artifacts contained, or objects contained in museums, are on display. In the United States, like when NAGPRA was passed with repatriation, that was like the big thing. Well, museums are going to be empty. They're going to empty the museums. We'll have nothing to show. And that just wasn't the case. But also, we've seen a big movement in the museum world of going towards digital, VR, AR. And then also blockbuster exhibits have become huge, where an exhibit travels around. So I think, like, especially with the Parthenon marbles, or some of these objects that are being kept in different museums away from their, indigenous, from, where they came from, that country gets it back. I can imagine these things start going on, be part of blockbuster exhibits. Like, museums adapt, they've always adapted. Same with other forms of science. So I think this call of, well, we won't have anything in our museum, it's like, that's not necessarily true, that there's still plenty of other objects or things to look at. I mean, we have rotating exhibits all the time, and we have blockbuster exhibitions. So yeah, I think it's kind of one of those things people get worried about, but it's not true. I mean, we've seen it through the past couple 100 years, how museums have adapted to new cultural norms. And I think this new one of museums going digital, 3D printing, for example. I know I think an archway from Syria, is that that example? There's some famous arch in Syria that was destroyed, but someone got a 3D model of it, and that's been going around. However, part of that is like a company has the legal rights to it, not the country itself, but that's a whole nother can of beans. But we have the technologies today where we can share information globally without having to ship these things. And, younger kids are much more intrigued by augmented reality and virtual reality. So they don't even care if it's a real object, but if they can manipulate something in digital space, we're seeing a huge, upsurgence of that, in museums investing in that kind of technology. So I think that's where we're kind of going forward. And once that's much more common in the museum world, a lot of these objects will start going back, because the value is no longer having them. At that point, they just cost money, right? I
think it was Palmyra.
Yes, that one. Mm-hmm.
Palmyra, yeah. it's actually quite interesting to see this, how they're doing this virtually, trying to do virtual education and sharing it. There's so many tools out there now.
Wasn't it Palmyra that was pretty much destroyed and an
By ISIS.
archaeologist was killed too? Wasn't that? There's
There
an
was
archaeologist who was killed because he was protecting.
I think it was in that region when they had a lot of tension.
Yeah, it was Palmyra. He was killed because he tried to protect the site.
But I think that one element that we're leaving out of this discussion in terms of museums is, as archaeologists, we want to believe that museums are primarily about education, but we all know that museums make money. Like you mentioned, there's a whole business around it. So I feel like part of this refusal to just give back things, it's because it's not just about education, because if it were, like you said, there's a lot of technologies right now to make educational curriculum and spaces, without holding on to this. But I feel like there is a deeper reason behind this refusal to repatriate, and in general to change the way we do things. As that at the end of the day, like we were talking about colonialism as something that is ongoing. It's not something that is past. It's not. It's the current order of the world is based on colonialism. So at some point, if these institutions which historically have been engaged in the making of, nations, and not any nation, just Western and Northern Hemisphere nations, they've been involved in the making of the history, and the history of the Western Hemisphere is based on, being on top, being winner, or whatever else term is being used, to describe the history of the West. So if you start suddenly, which is not sudden actually, but like acknowledging how, and Maria, you used this metaphor of a shirt being a loan, but it wasn't a loan, it was stolen, in this sense. So it's what does it mean for museum and culture institutions of the West to acknowledge that they have been involved in stealing and sometimes in murdering and in violent processes? And what does it mean for the Northern Hemisphere in general to acknowledge that the current order of the world, where they are dominant in terms of, accesses and structures and everything, is just based on violence, and it means that the world in its entirety has to shift, has to change. Because if you just, and like you said, Egypt right now has, the facilities to receive their own things. So what does it mean to have all Egyptian things back to Egypt, back to the African continent specifically? It means that all the business around going to these museums, that whole everything, does not exist anymore. It's not necessarily the education that they're worried about. They're worried about something else. And this is why I feel like we really need to have these conversations about how political science is, because I feel like sometimes we just say it like, oh, science is political, but we don't really see the implications on a concrete level, of the work we do and the stories we tell and the narrative that we create. It's all inserted in a world order, and in this world order, there is inequalities, there's like historical consequences that still hurt, people on a concrete basis. Right now, we can see it with the current situation of coronavirus, for example. We don't have the same countries suffering the same level, and it's all based on this long-term history. And as archaeologists, we're equipped to see that and to analyze that, and I feel like sometimes we really fragment the history of materiality that we do, like, oh, I'm doing this and this context specifically, but it's all tied. And I feel like even we don't necessarily acknowledge how we can participate in a conversation about the global world right now. We're just continuing to fragment the stories we tell, like they're separated from the current world order.
Well, just going on what you said, we actually had a question via YouTube. Hello, Alexander. And he asked, how has colonialism affected the modern world? Why is it important for society to talk about this topic? So just as Gabby sort of started to say, it is becoming more so very topical. And I feel even by having this, it's a step in the right direction, I would hope. And I have noticed even, I can't remember if it was the Current Archaeology or British Archaeology magazine, they even started talking about the term Anglo-Saxon. Should we use this term? And it's so interesting how there's so many things ingrained in society that we do not even notice. I personally have not noticed or even questioned. So Alexander, I hope this somewhat answers your question. And does anybody have anything else to add regarding that? No? Okay. Whilst Maria, I can see Maria's thinking, there's one thing I wanted to say, and it's a quote that really resonated. It was, history belongs to its geography. So this was a quote used by some Indian activists who were trying to repatriate their artifacts, and it was kind of like their campaign. And it's just really interesting to think of it from that point of view. Yes, history belongs to its location, geographically speaking, and to the people, but something that I do like about museums is the opportunity to see something, physically see it. But this is me being more tactile, right? If I want to read a book, I could read it on a tablet or on my phone. So it's just, I think, changing the way that we're used to interpreting information. And I think this is actually happening now. By us being at home, a lot of us are working online. We're changing the way we do things. There's a lot of virtual simulators of museum galleries and collections. We want to research something, we can just quickly go into Google, and most likely we'll find information about an archaeological site or an artifact. So I think things are changing a lot, and I hope that answers your question, Alexander. Also, apparently there are some really interesting books. Thank you, Archaeologist_EM on Instagram. And he said there's actually quite a few books now focusing on the Middle Eastern archaeology, which is assessing and stabilizing sites destroyed by ISIS and other terror groups in the Middle East. So there's definitely more work going on now into, I think, preservation and maybe what's been lost. So both very interesting. So thank you for your comments on that. Now, I feel like we have spoken a lot about it, and I know it's only the beginning. I feel like it's only the beginning. So if there's any more questions from Instagram or YouTube, now is your chance. And whilst I wait for them, maybe anything else that anybody would like to add?
Yeah, I think I have a question for everybody. So, I mean, in archaeology, we're all aware of the show like Ancient Aliens and some of these pseudo-archaeological shows and theories that have come up. But like, do you believe those to be inherently colonial ideas? Specifically to some of these shows and how they really pinpoint non-European cultures as having to have interference from aliens in order to get these things done.
I'm actually not sure, because like they also think that Stonehenge was built by giants. So I don't think it's necessarily because it is not European. I think it's a thought way of ancient people were stupid, rather. That's how I see it most often, is that like, oh, they don't have the technology that we have today, so they couldn't have done it because they were stupid, basically. Because also when you look, it's often like the pyramids or stuff in the Middle East, and that's where you have the earliest cultures, like urban societies, and where you have a lot of these things. So I think it's more to do with that than like, it's more the idea. I'm in a group on Facebook, Forbidden Archaeology, and I'm only there because to see all of these weird alien theories and stuff. And there was one where it was like, they put a picture up where there was this giant stone that was perfectly round, and they're like, oh, this must have been aliens who did it because they couldn't have done anything this perfectly round 5,000 years ago. And I was like, what is this thing about saying ancient people were stupid? Like, think about like the person who invented invented fire. Where would we be without fire today? Like the period I study where you have the first agricultural societies, like would we even be able to have societies like we have today without agriculture, right? So like it's all about the perspective, because of course like we have computers today, we have so many innovative stuff today, but like back then agriculture was fucking a big deal, because like, hey, we're doing something great and now we can live 3,000 people together. We couldn't do that before. So I think it's more
Maria,
like people are stupid. Yeah.
I think what you say is interesting, and I think it's a mix of both what you said and colonialism, because what is actually shared between these two approaches is the othering. So we have an other, and it's particularly interesting for us archaeologists to think about that. We have an othering of in terms of time, you know, and we have an othering in terms of culture, and this is and race as well, obviously, and gender and other different aspects that serve to actually justify the current order of the world. So this othering makes people today, and it's based on the whole notion of development. For example, this idea of development that today is we're better off than we were before, you know. So today we know more than we knew before. And so the othering in terms of time, it is extremely interesting because it has to do with why there is so much archaeology in the Americas that is done on indigenous people and African people, because we in this and the Orientalism and all of these writings about colonialism will pinpoint that in the sense of the other in terms of time and culture. In terms of culture, it belongs to another time. So if there's an other right now, it needs to be, this person needs to be changed, and this group needs to be changed because it belongs to prehistory, to ancient times. So we would not, the Western way of the world will not respect non-Western perspectives on how the world is, because it belongs to the past. You know, they don't know, they don't have the science. And so the logic of development is in colonialism, and which is why we still have colonialism right now, because we still have this logic of development. Deep down, for example, a lot of people still think that Western science will has all the answers, and non-Western sciences are not science. You know, they're folklore. They're, you know, we have other terms to not put them in the same equal space, you know, to not put non-Western knowledge modes in the same space as Western knowledge modes. So all of this is based on cultural differences, but also on time differences. So, which is why it explains that people will not believe that indigenous ways of perceiving the world or actually saying things that Western science is revealing suddenly right now. But when we were saying it, it was primitive. It was not, you know, right. It was not science. But then Western science comes for it in terms that are acceptable, and it is justified and legitimized, you know. So I think the whole othering in terms of culture, which is really blatant in colonialism, is also the othering in terms of time, you know. It's in Brazil. I'm based in Brazil right now, and you have a lot of white people mainly who question if there are still indigenous peoples, you know. So it's like indigenous peoples are seen as from the past, you know, and still using terms like prehistory, for example, which is why it's interesting having these conversations, because we're even questioning the terms that we're using in our practice, in our theory, in everything. And using history, for example, to determine that it's the stories from European context, specifically in the Americas, you know, and prehistory is before European context. So what determines what is history is the European presence. Before history is not European, you know. These little differences are interesting, because we could say it's indigenous history. It's not necessarily written to be history, you know.
Yeah.
I think what the history term is, like, I've always just been taught that like history is before writing, of after writing. So that would be like, what is it, 5,200 years ago, writing was invented, and then you have history. So like the history is with the documentation of stuff in writing, right? So yeah, I agree with you. Like, it's
And you see how problematic you see how problematic it is when it implies that to be peoples who would be of today, you would have to write your history. So it means that you cannot, if you don't have um, um, written records, for example, you belong to before, you know what I mean? So there is a logic of development in terms of history for different culture areas who, and it's, I mean, a lot of West Africa, for example, what had, and it's, I mean, Western Africa mainly, I have a lot of interest in that specifically. But you would see that the oral tradition is extremely elaborate. You would see that specifically in the area known as Malu today, where, you know, you have, I mean, it's indigenous cultures around the world in general who do not have the written record, do not lack writing skills. It's been a choice that is being culturally made to use orality to transmit knowledge and to hold memories. It's not because they lacked knowledge, you know. Writing is a choice that is being made culturally or not, but it has been evoked as something that put people in a position of superiority or inferiority until now. So it has.
That's just really interesting, because I've never thought of it before like that. Like, because I've been working mostly in prehistory, and I'm working in a field where you have this like very early history where it's like the invention of first writing. And I live in a country where, yeah, we have like oral traditions, like with the Vikings and stuff. And but I've never ever thought about the concept like that. And it's so interesting to me. So I'm like mind blown right now.
There's something actually that was said via YouTube by New Archaeological School, so Privyet, they're from Ukraine, and they mentioned a theory. So there's also a topic of intellectual colonialism. So for example, the use of third world countries and the archaeological efforts by European archaeologists taking advantage of the former needs. And they say it's a different topic, but actually I would say it's one of what we were just speaking about, because it's true, the intellectual side, right? So if you are from, they called it civilized missions, if memory serves. During the 16th century, the Spanish classed it as their civilizing missions when they would colonize non-Christian countries. Yeah, they used religion as an effort to colonize this region. So if we use even that, I would say that is kind of like the roots of colonialism, the intellectual side, thinking that they're better than another region.
Right.
Carlton, yeah.
Big shout out to New Archaeological School in Ukraine. I know those guys. I worked with them last summer when I did my expert fieldwork in Ukraine, so I'm pretty sure I know who's talking. Yeah, but back to your Spanish mission concept. I mean, like, even going to that conversation about what historic and prehistoric, all those early Spanish written records that which inhabit that historic space are all embellished or falsified, like, even though that they're more legitimate or seemingly so from a colonial point of view. Like, the Spanish lied about a lot of stuff going on in the New World, to make a case that, oh, we need to get rid of these people. You know, I mean, completely embellished how much the Aztecs were sacrificing people. Same with the Incas, and how horrible the living conditions were. And it was like through archaeology in the 1980s, when people were kind of going back, I think there was a big court case in Peru trying to figure out, it actually wasn't in the 1980s. It was in, I think, the 1600s or 1700s, trying to figure out land rights. And the Spanish records were to be found to be totally falsified, and the oral traditions were correct as to what actually occurred. So in terms of that intellectual colonialism, I think that's absolutely part of what we've been talking about. You're talking about a culture that sees themselves as superior technologically and culturally, coming into a region and using civilization or civilizing as a means to to legitimize their control over an area, because they see themselves as smarter, and all the things that kind of go along with that.
Yeah, actually, that was something I've been thinking about throughout this whole conversation is ethnographic studies that we use in archaeology too. And those started out often being like Christian missionaries going somewhere and then be like reporting back how people acted to anthropologists, for example, who wanted to study it. It would be difficult to travel and stuff like that. So you would get your reports from Christian missionaries. And what to keep in mind is like Christian missionaries went there because they thought less of the people. They wanted to save them, convert them. So they had this understanding of the people living here, they need to be saved. They are not as good as us. We need to like make them better and save them so they can go to heaven, stuff like that. So they would like not observe them in a like objective way. They would observe them through that lens that they were savages or something like that. And that's still like, I feel like ethnographic studies, like also through like the 1900s, you have the big issue of like gender too, that it's like white men going to a small scale society, and then the only people they talk to there is the leader of the society. They don't talk to the women or children or like the normal people. They only speak to the leader. So you have like this really skewed up until like probably the 80s or something, where you just have like really bad information because it's like women aren't spoken to in these societies. When an ethnographic person comes and is like, hey, I'm going to do this ethnographic study, I'm just going to talk to one person who is in the position of leadership, they don't know what the hell is going on in other like layers of the society. And I just feel like we need to be careful using ethnographic studies also still today, because it's still often this white person or European person coming to a different culture. And we often like, we have biases. We can never be fully objective. So like, and it's, that Christian guy who went and got himself killed because he wanted to convert a tribe, where was it, the East Indies or something? Yeah, he wanted to go and just like convince them to become Christians, and he got killed. And people were like, oh, that's so sad. But it's like, yeah, but maybe he should have just bought out and let people be. And like, so, and he saw himself as an adventurer, and kind of like he would probably identify himself as doing ethnography because he was trying to document their lives too. Yeah. So I actually wanted to talk a bit about ethnography because we use it so much.
Yeah, and even what we look at in the archaeological record, exactly like ethnography, it's biased as well. During so long, I mean, what archaeologists would look like were just, what they would project about their own background. And a lot of research is being done about the images of, for example, ancient times, called commonly prehistory, that we have. We have the man, the hunter, and woman, the gatherer, and these whole ideas that are actually based on like 20th century ideas about gender, about what a household should look like, and not necessarily paying attention to what material remains would tell us.
I actually have this a kind of an issue right now with like the subject of my thesis is children. And children are really underrepresented in archaeology. So that's kind of like the same issue with like, there's a broad focus on men and the men in leadership. That has been like the big focus for so long because they had the good artifacts in their graves and stuff like that. And they wrote history and shit like that. But like, so like until the 90s, there is no such thing as archaeology of childhood. That started like in the late 80s with the feminism in archaeology. You started talking about children, but that was in relation to women and mothers. It wasn't in relation to themselves. So when I sit and try to gather information of burials of children in the pre-pottery and Neolithic, I have the disadvantage that that they're not recorded proper, and that you have like early excavations, they would kind of just like sieve and then think that child bones might be just from an animal and throw them out, or they've been registered wrongly. And there's just like this really big issue. And still today you have the issue of like archaeology of childhood is kind of like its own field in many ways. So which is great because there's a broader focus, but it also means that like you have to find specific journals and publications. It's not just included if you have like a book with reports from a site. You have to go to a different book to find anything of children. So it's like very separated still. But yeah, that's just another way of saying that like the way we have perceived sites and archaeology is so dominated of who have done the archaeology. Like, yeah.
I mean, we've spoken about so many topics, subcategories within such a large discipline that it's not even necessarily classed as a discipline, I would say. I don't think many people even have the opportunity to study colonialism. In my like personal experience of trying to research an opportunity to do a master's, I found one place in Ireland. So it's such a large topic. And there's one last comment that we could maybe slightly address, which is the Navajo Nation in the American Southwest is still viewed primitive peoples. Trump is threatening their national monuments. Most of the reservation has no running water and no one wants to. ... Carlton, I know you've mentioned it a few times already.
Yeah, so the Navajo, as they're called, but they call themselves the Dene. That's what they refer to, the Dene Nation. It's not just the Dene, it's everybody. You know, all indigenous nations in the United States are seen as primitive or less than. You know, they have one of the, I think, the largest Native American reservation here in the States. You know, and a lot of Indian reservations in the States are basically land that the United States didn't want. So, you know, they were put into a part of the desert that no one wanted. And they've been able to thrive off of sheep. And then once uranium was found there, they've made some money off of uranium mining. But, you know, yeah, indigenous nations in the United States are seen as primitive. We've seen it all the time. You know, 4 or 5 years ago or 3 years ago with Dakota Access Pipeline, where U.S. government was illegally putting a pipeline through a Native American reservation and ancestral site, and people peacefully protested, and they were shot at with water hoses in the freezing cold in January. You know, they got the full force of the American military state, and no one cared. And it's kind of a problem that we see, not just, you know, with the Navajo in terms of COVID. In South Dakota, there's 2 reservations where they've shut down their roads because they don't want people coming in and out and spreading the virus. And the South Dakota governor said, no, you're going to open your roads. And it's now a legal battle because the tribe's like, well, we own the roads and we're technically sovereign nations that live within the United States, so we can do what we want. And I mean, part of talk about colonization and colonialism is still extremely relevant in the United States as well as elsewhere. You know, especially with the indigenous nations here. And even with something that we don't really talk about in the United States, half the United States used to be Mexico. And, you know, a lot of the Hispanic community that lives here, you know, they didn't cross the border crossed them. And they have their own rights of indigeneity to that aspect and how they're treated. I mean, it's like the US is just, it's a mess on so many levels. But yeah. We're still seen as primitive, unfortunately.
Sorry.
No, I was just thinking we have the same issue with how people view indigenous people in Greenland, in Denmark, actually. Because there's this thing about, like, so we have like people drink a lot of alcohol in Denmark, right? And so we have homeless people on the street drinking, and there is, I wouldn't say an overrepresentation necessarily, but there are indigenous Greenland people who live on the street who drink a lot. So because of this, a lot of Danish people associate indigenous Greenland people, people from Greenland, as alcoholics. And when they come to Denmark, they are just alcoholics. They are not seen as like part of like the nation of Denmark in some ways, because they kind of are. They have like seats in the parliament and stuff, but they're not seen in that way. And like we've been really, really mean to Greenland, the Danes and Denmark in general. And that's kind of a colonialism thing too, the way Denmark has treated Greenland and their people. They've been used in medical experiments, and they've been like mistreated in extreme ways. And that is still a thing that like our new prime minister gave an official excuse for an incident, a horrible incident that happened, I think, 50 years ago. And she's the first one who has come out and apologized on the behalf of the state of Denmark. It was some boys who had been like mistreated like horribly at a what do you call it? You know, a place where children go where they have no parents. Sorry.
Oh, orphanage. Yeah.
Orphanage. Sorry. They have been like horribly like sexually abused and stuff like that, and nobody had intervened. And she's the first one. They've been asking for an excuse for like years and years, and like other prime ministers just been like, nah, we're not gonna give that excuse, because we still have this weird like Greenland is less, which is horrible. The same prime minister was the one who denied giving Greenland to Trump. She was like, no way, Greenland is Greenland, it cannot be bought. Fuck off, Trump. So she's done some good stuff, but yeah, it's really horrible.
Well, I mean, it's we see these comments about how indigenous peoples, and I would say non-Western and non-Westernized people in the general ways, are seen and treated as primitive. And it's again what we were talking about, the whole idea of development, and this development and civilization being associated with the West and Western ways of perceiving the world and Western knowledge and everything. And I think this is why, I mean, Brazil is no different. I mean, the whole world now is I think it's so interesting to hear about Greenland indigenous people, because I rarely hear about them. But we know that indigenous people all around the world are being treated like that, because at the end of the day, the whole idea behind it is the whole development thing being equated with being Western or Westernized. So if you don't, this is a form of, some people have been calling ethnocide and some others are calling genocide, because you're making peoples disappear, and you're making people disappear not willingly. It's not just, oh, we're changing because, you know, oh, something is nice, we're just going to adopt it. No, it's a pressure that is structural, and that is imposed like over centuries, and you don't have any rest from it. Like Carlton mentioned about the Navajo, for example. In the US, you would have this concept of having sovereign nations, for example. Well, in Guyana, France doesn't even recognize the existence of the indigenous communities as indigenous, because according to France, it would be against its constitution that sees everyone as equal, even if this means, you know, denying people from, you know, their own autonomy and self-decisions and, you know, rights to their own territory. So this is highly problematic, but no one will say that, oh, France is actually denying the rights today. You know, everyone will continue seeing France as a country of freedom and whatever else their ideology is. In how does archaeology fit into this equation, you know, because sometimes it's so easy for us to just talk about that and you know, be, I would say, horrified, and we talk about it, but then when we do our work, we don't see it as related to it, but it is, because when we do some research that actually creates a narrative about the past that goes with the same logics of development and colonialism and imperialism, we're actually helping the whole structure, you know. So I mean, in Brazil, I have examples of archaeologists who are actually called by indigenous groups to help them. It's a political movement, really. It's a political use of archaeology to call an archaeologist, and so that this person help them establish what their territory limits are in order to use that, you know, with the government, you know. So obviously, there's a lot of talk about that, about what it means to have a determined political use of science, but science is already used politically, you know. It's just that in this sense, not the same people who use it. So that's an interesting thought to have, and yet also not falling into the trap, I would say, of seeing archaeology as the savior, or archaeologists in sort of white saviorism, because most of these archaeologists are white, are like, oh, you need us to, like, you know, prove that you were there. And a lot of that is actually tricky, because we need to establish the balance about, between knowing how political our science can be, but also not necessarily thinking that our own narrative is what is going to save the day, you know, because people have their own worldviews. And at the end of the day, no one really needs archaeology. This is a really problematic thought that a lot of archaeologists are totally against even hearing. But if we think about it, it's a science that is a product of times before us, but of our time. But in itself, it do people need infrastructures. People right now need things that are helping them on a day-to-day basis. Archaeology can be a part of this conversation if we make the relationship between past times and present times. But in itself, the knowledge created by archaeology does not help anyone get running water, you know, or electricity.
Well, I think on that, oh, Carlton, go on.
Yeah, I think just like important, you know, talking about decolonizing, and you know, there's the UN Declaration of Indigenous of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's only a handful of countries that didn't sign it, and they're primarily English speaking. So the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, United Kingdom. I'm not sure if France did or not. But why that's important in archaeology is that, like, if your government doesn't even support like a UN declaration of treating people equally, and they are the ones with the money, and they have the agencies or the ministries that fund the research, you know, it's a it's a trickle down system of prioritization. If your government doesn't prioritize indigenous people or indigenous rights, that's going to affect the funding that supports the science. And that's going to alter the questions that scientists like archaeologists are going to ask in order to get funding, you know. As generally, if archaeologists are not the most wealthy people in society, if we were concerned about money, we would have gone into marketing, but we like, you know, archaeology, so we deal with it. So it really has to be kind of a societal shift in some of these countries. And, you know, it's not just the you know, Western world, or, you know, like Norway and Finland, for example, have the Sami, who are hunter like reindeer pastoralists, and they're treated horribly. Even though they're whiter than snow. So it doesn't even really necessarily come down to color, but of someone's skin, but just like different ways of life. And like the Sami have lived in Scandinavia for God knows how long before the agriculturalists showed up, and they're treated extremely poorly. So it's a top-down system, but I mean, how do you make it top-down? Is you just make awareness of more prominent, like this, you know, Archaeologists in Quarantine that you're doing, having this topic, and we're educating a bunch of people across the world. You know, we have, this is great, archaeologists from North America, South America, Europe, and working in different places, like the amount of people that we can reach. And that's part of the whole paradigm shift, is education, right? And making these things known to other people.
And I think on that note, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to all of you today. Of course, anyone who's watching it right now, if you have any more questions, please put it in the comments, and maybe if there's just enough, we could all come back together and discuss it further. So for now, thank you, everybody. YouTube, it's been great. We'll see you next week, where I'll be discussing all things social and sort of the science side of communicating archaeology to the public with no other than Dig It with Raven. So until then, see you all next week.